consultant, author, and oil painter. That's a lot. U.S. as well as internationally. He entered the public relations field with the American Red Cross and managed press relations during national and international disasters, such as this meeting. Directed the organization's response to the blood supply hysteria that rose early in the HIV crisis. In 1989, he was seconded to the International Red Cross for an assignment in the Sudan, and he documented Red Cross efforts to address the effects of famine and civil war. How long does this go on? Oh, okay. At Altacor oversaw international public relations for affiliates in Asia, Europe, and Africa, and managed press relations for the organization's Nagano Olympics sponsorship. Also led Altacor's public relations strategy for evolving technology issues such as social media, commerce, and Y2K. Remember that?
No.
For Delphi Automotive and Owens Corning, he served as a consultant for clients such as Johnson & Johnson and focused solely on technology-related corporate communication issues, both internal and external. His experience working with the technologists on communication and challenges inspired his book, The Brainiac Paradox. Is that in the library? I don't think I've seen a copy.
Is it? It is, it was.
Oh,
Okay.
well, if it's not, we need another copy. Reading interests include technology, politics, economics, science, sociology, and most of all, history, with special emphasis on Benjamin Franklin, a blood relative, and other founding fathers. Diversions include genealogy, woodworking, classic auto restoration and travel, and he's visited 39 countries in 5 continents. In 1986, he married Elizabeth Bear of Oakwood, Ohio, and they have 3 sons, Peter, William, and Charles. He joined the Prismatic Club in 2005 and has served as the club's Grand Poobah and treasurer, Mr. Mark Cornillie.
A note before I get started, there are going to be some blank slides that come up, so don't panic when you see those. Those are there intentionally. I vividly remember attending my first prismatic paper, the lights dimming, and the faces of early prisms looking on as the speaker began to speak, just as they are now with me. It was a surreal experience. And again, maybe it was the Scotch. Scotch or not, we prisms love our portraits. We love them for their curious poses, the lighting, the facial expression. We love them for the painters that painted them and the interesting people they painted. But most of all, we love them because they span our history and connect us to our founding members. Beyond our personal attachment, though, these paintings are great cultural and historical, of great historical and cultural significance. These are beautifully crafted portraits, often of historically important men, created by formally trained artists working at the high watermark of portraiture. These artists stood on the shoulders of Van Eyck, Da Vinci, Hals, and Rembrandt. By accident, if you will, we have become curators of an important group of paintings. Sadly, though, these are also a reminder of what's been lost. With the birth of modernism in the early 20th century, the art establishment nearly vanquished representative art. You would be hard-pressed to find the work of this caliber today. The problem is traditional portraiture is insanely difficult. Just ask Cecilia Gimenez. She didn't even have to do a portrait, she just was going to do a little touch-up. This is a 1930 fresco entitled Ecce Homo, behold the man. Her task was to replace paint that had flaked off. This is the result.
Oh my goodness.
Some refer to this as Ecca Mono. Behold the monkey. While it's easy to make fun of, those who have attempted portraiture can empathize. My first passion was drawing, and by age 11, I had started oil painting. Over the next years, I tried different subject matter, but from the beginning I was drawn, excuse the pun, to portraits, possibly because they are so challenging. Foolishly, I tried a portrait my first time out. I'll spare you that one. My surname, Cornillie, is Flemish. I was naturally drawn to the Flemish style, but when I entered high school, my freshman art teacher tried to cure me. She hounded me to abandon my personal aesthetics and to adopt hers, modern art. So at age 14, I switched to photography, which would lead to photojournalism, then journalism, then corporate communication and technology consulting, as Ken went through. But I always felt like linseed oil coursed through my veins. And there's a chance that it still is, considering how much I inhaled over the years. I love the smell of linseed oil, by the way. I mean, on special date nights, I'll have Liz spray a little bit on my Though I only painted for about 3 years in my youth, it instilled in me a lifelong appreciation for the craft, particularly portraiture. Thus, I have a natural affinity to these paintings. My hope tonight is to share some of that with you, to have you see these very old paintings in a new light. The best way to do that is with experience. So I'm going to ask my assistants to bring out the canvases and the oils right now. Okay. Well, that's not quite practical, so we're going to do the next best thing. And that is something that some might find heretical, and that is to use science and logic to convey a deeper appreciation for art. There are more ways to appreciate art than there are stars in the heaven. Everyone has their own interests and tastes. Here I'm going to focus on a very narrow one, the admiration that comes from understanding the incredible challenges of traditional portrait painting and the intrinsic beauty of overcoming them with great craft. The ultimate question for representative art is simply one: how does it look compared to what it's supposed to? There are three basic factors that determine that: drafting, tonal values, and color. Drafting refers to the arrangement of shapes in 2 dimensions that represent what we see in 3 dimensions. I'm sure everyone will have tried drawing at some point in their life and will understand the challenge. In landscape, still lifes, and other genres, there's usually a little bit of wiggle room. You can get away with things being a little bit off, but not so with traditional portraits. This is because our brains are literally wired to recognize faces. I've heard it estimated that roughly half of the brain is involved in some aspect of visual processing, and half of that is involved with human facial recognition. To demonstrate that, I'm going to flash on the screen a succession of a dozen faces. These are faces or people that most of you should be familiar with, maybe not some of the younger people here, but I'm not testing you for recall. This isn't a memory test. The question you should be asking yourself as these are flashed quickly in front of you is, do these faces register as recognized? I put the focus
That's recognizable.
Here. The focus here, because that's where the eyes are going to be, and that's just kind of a help for you. Kind of focus in that area. You'll see the eyes, and that'll help you.
Wow.
Were you able to recognize any of those?
Yeah.
Now consider how similar those faces were to each other, because they're all white men, kind of middle-aged. There's no different skin color, no gender, nothing like that. These are all very similar people. As a matter of fact, if I was to print those out on transparencies and lay them out on a light table, you would see very little changes from positioning from one person to the next. And yet, flashing at literally 1/12 of a second, you are able to recognize those faces. That's
fascinating.
yeah. It's truly amazing. It helps explain why portraiture is so difficult. Part of the problem is that while we can recognize faces really well, our ability to define that is very difficult. If I was to have you sit in front of a criminal portrait art sketch and ask you to describe someone you know very well, there are certain things you wouldn't be able to do. Based purely on your explanation, you probably wouldn't get a good likeness, because it's kind of a subconscious one-way feature.
Yeah.
Our brains are virtually a Chef Gordon Ramsay,
Yeah.
critically rejecting when presented with anything that is less than perfect. The ability to capture a likeness freehand, to size, shape, and align forms properly is an amazing feat.
Yeah.
Tonal values are essentially the brightness or darkness of picture elements. These are important to achieving natural 3D likeness. Actually, it's the most important thing. And they're deceptively difficult to handle. Consider this picture. Other than the green cone or sphere, most people trying to paint this would mix up a series of light or dark grays for the board. But to do it accurately, they would need to realize that squares A and B are the same color.
Wow.
Anyone doubt? Oh,
Yeah. The shadow does it.
observations?
Yes.
It's hard to see.
In a sense, our brain is working against us. And painters must override what they think they see. In case you think this was just a carefully created illusion, consider our portrait of John Bissell. Now, if we were mixing colors for his face, we might have two basic sets of colors, one to deal with the portions of skin in the light and those in the shadow. But in this highlight on the right side, I think you can see it there under his eye, is actually lighter than the shadow under his left eye. I go back to that originally. That, yeah, do this.
Now you can see it once you're told, but you wouldn't think otherwise.
So this is darker than that. Next is color, light tonal values. We can't count on what we think we see. Now, as hard as it is to believe, those two dogs are the same color. I myself found that hard to believe, so I isolated the background, made it all black, and you can see it. I even lined them up on the same plane. Because when I looked at this, I just said to myself, there's no way that those two are the same color.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Most people would describe white skin, Caucasian skin, as something kind of a peach-like. But it requires a range of colors, many unexpected. Consider this picture of George Lothrop. When we see him from a distance, it looks like a vibrant and accurate depiction of skin tone. But when we examine it up close, we find a wide range of subordinate colors. Look at the color under the bottom of the ear, or in the ear, under the side of the face, under the nose, or on the side of the nose. The heart of the problem is that we expect our eyes to perceive images objectively. You remember this dress? Half the population insisted that it was blue and black, and the others insisted it was white and gold. And please don't bring it up because we don't want a big fight here about what it is.
Well, what was it?
So what was it?
I'm not going to say. We think that our eyes operate like cameras, but they don't. The images projected on the retinas are upside down. We only see color at the very center, and we have a blind spot where at the optical nerve head. If you were to actually have an image of what your eye sees, there'd be a big blank hole in it, but your brain fills that in. Finally, beyond drafting and tonal values and color, there's what's called the artist's curse. Now, this effect takes a little time, so I'm going to ask you to start staring at this while I continue to talk. I think it is. I want you to stare at this bottom star here, and preferably right at this very corner. And for some of you whose view is blocked, just find the star, the lowest right star that you can see. And I want you to stare at that. I'll tell you what to do in about 30 seconds. What this is intended to demonstrate is that our eyes and brain are constantly adjusting to the color of what we see. For those familiar with digital photography, it's a type of internal white balance. For others, recall how old cameras would provide very warm colors of pictures taken indoors. Our eyes adjust to minimize that by adding complementary colors. The colors you see on the screen right now are the complementary hues of red, white, and blue.
Yeah.
Do people see a flag on this?
Yeah.
The problem for artists is that oil painting is usually a very, very slow process. And when you stare at something for a very long time, you lose your color objectivity. You also lose your spatial objectivity. If you paint an ear a little too small or large, your brain will accommodate that ear. Eventually, it might look fine to you. It's like an eternal mother. Oh, isn't that just wonderful? When asked what made him such a great hockey player, Wayne Gretzky said, he simply skated to where the puck was going, not where it is. Portrait artists need to paint what the color should be, not what they think it is.
Very nice.
And to that, they need to understand the physics that to be able to deal with the light on highlights and shadows. They need to understand biology to deal with the transparency of skin and the color of tissue underneath. They need to understand chemistry to deal with the interplay of natural pigments and mediums. And they need to understand psychology so that they can connect effectively to their audience. For over half a millennia, artists have contended with these issues and overcome them, passing down their secrets to the next generation of artists. Much of that, unfortunately, has been lost in the last 100 years. Here's a dual portrait you might be familiar with. Of course, this is an amateur painter. Do people recognize who that is and who the painter is?
Bushes.
Bushes, and George W. was the painter. But again, he's an amateur. Here is an official portrait, a paid commission. Now, you might like these last two paintings, and you might even feel that they're great art. But I think it's fair to say that they fall short in the terms of drafting, tonal value, and color. Did anyone recognize who this is a portrait of?
No,
No.
Prince
Prince Williams.
Prince William, see?
took some effort.
When he had hair.
Now let's discuss the second part of the title, The Painter's Painter. Anyone have an idea who that is, by the way?
Da Vinci.
Anyone else? No? So in recent years, I returned to my first love, painting, and I undertook it in a portrait of my life love, Liz. It's far from finished, but it demonstrates a point. Starting to paint again with a portraiture after several decades was as foolish as attempting a portrait my first time out at 11. Somehow I thought I could just pick it up again, but with the advantage of an adult brain. Foolish me. Anyway, while I worked on this portrait, I often played artist documentaries or interviews in the background to both inspire and inform me. And as I did, I was stunned to hear artists citing one particular artist for virtuosity and seemingly effortless painting. Years earlier, I had the very same reaction when I saw this artist's work. Liz and I were at the Cochrane Gallery in DC, and I remember walking into the room, a room filled with gorgeous paintings, and this one just stood out to me. I was amazed. Not only was it beautiful, but it seemed technically flawless, and the brushwork was stunning. I'd go up, back up, go up, back up. It's a huge painting. As we moved on, I was captured by another painting, drastically different from the first, but equally compelling. And it was by the same artist. I've since experienced this phenomenon several times, and now search for this artist's work whenever we travel. John Singer Sargent was born in Florence to American parents in 1856. While he lived most of his life in Europe, he always considered himself American. At an early age, he demonstrated a formidable talent, and he moved to Paris to receive a formal artist education. By 21, he was accepted into the annual Paris Salon. This was really the most prestigious art thing in the world, and he was able to get in by 21. Some artists would work their lives to try to get accepted into that. By 23, he won the gold prize. Henry James wrote, "Sargent offers a slightly uncanny spectacle of a talent which, at the very threshold of its career, has nothing more to learn." Here's some other paintings by him.
Well, satin.
Over time, he became the most sought-after portrait painter of his time. And here are a couple examples of those. There's a good story behind this one, but unfortunately I had to cut it in time. His real love, though, was landscape and figurative painting and capturing people in more natural settings. He loved painting pictures of people doing things, particularly his painter friends' painting. I love that. That's Monet. Both this picture and the picture Monet was painting are in the Boston Fine Arts Museum. This Rodin. While he's most famous for his commissioned portraits, he eventually got fed up with them or more accurately, trying to please his clients. Women don't ask you to make them beautiful, Sargent wrote, but you can feel them wanting you to. And it wasn't just the women. This is a close-up of a portrait of his mentor and teacher, Carlos Duran, and next to a picture. And you can see that while a very good likeness, it's a very flattering one of Duran. Just as people typically don't like the sound of their recorded voice, they often object to how they're portrayed visually. Mm-hmm. The definition of a portrait, he famously said, is a picture with a little something wrong with the mouth. And sadly, he said, every time I painted a portrait, I lost a friend.
Oh my God.
By the late 1890s, he vowed to give them up, despite having people clamoring in line to pay the equivalent of over $200,000 today to have them painted. To placate those insisting on portraits, he would often do charcoal sketches, something he could just do in an afternoon. These allow us to isolate his command of both drafting and tonal values. I don't have much to say about these because I think they pretty much speak for themselves.
Yeah. Oh,
There's currently an exhibit devoted to them at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. They're there until I think January, and I'm hoping to go see them. As for color, we can isolate his fidelity to it by examining a painting that is at the DIA collection. And it's one of my favorite paintings, and it's one that I'm sure most people walk by and don't even think about. As you look at this, I want you to throw your eyes out of focus and look at it. If you're like me, you can just take off your glasses. The scene comes alive in front of you. This despite the paint being almost thrown on the canvas as he dealt with the rapidly changing light at that time of day. For those who painted and know what it's like to paint at that time of day out in the plein air, it's an amazing challenge. Beyond his absolute mastery of drafting, tonal values, and color, what really set him apart was his incredible brushwork. In the early 1600s, painter, teacher, and chronicler of early Dutch painters, Carl van Mander, said, "There are two perfect manners for painting, the rough and the neat." Sorry for all the jargon. Mander advised young painters they should wait to paint roughly because it is actually more difficult. Here are two great examples from our own collection. One on the left, obviously, very neat. The one on the right, very rough. The genius of Sargent was that he would, from painting to painting or within painting, switch fluidly between these approaches. Now, as I discussed earlier, this is the first Sargent I saw exhibited, and I talked about going close up and far back. Now look at the pearls around her neck and how they're painted. And her hands. Wow. And the luscious satin dress is composed of wide, long strokes and chunks of white. It's an amazing virtuosity. This is referred to as bravura style, which bravura translated actually just means cleverness. It's a kind of visual alchemy, and he was the master of it. If you look up bravura online, you'll see Sargent come up. As one critic said, "Is it possible that the brush can get such softness by such rough touches and such apparent caresses to be so attractive?" Here's an extreme example of his rough painting. Let's see the close up there. If there was one painting in the world that I could have, it'd be this one. In a recent article, Tim Sun said, Lady Agnew goes beyond formal portraiture and transports the viewer into a realm of elegance and intrigue. There's a story behind this one too, but again, no time. Unfortunately, Sargent suffered from bad timing. The end of his career overlapped with the rise of modernism, and his death coincided with the birth of Dadaism. Portraits from the Gilded Age were the antithesis of these movements, and his legacy was largely trashed. In 1931, Louis Mumford called him a mere illustrator whose work was characterized by contemptuous and cynical superficiality. In recent years, though, representative art has made a comeback, and critics and collectors are showing increased interest in Sargent. If auction prices are any indication, Sargent's Group with Parasols sold for $24 million in 2004, which is a record for American Impressionist paintings. And it doubled the high end of Saucony's estimate at the time, and dwarfed the record for the previous American Impressionist, and that was Kashmir, which sold for $10 million in 1996, and is also a Sargent. What's primarily amazing is that when you see very high prices for artwork, it is usually for artists who created limited works in their lifetime, or limited works that existed. There are only 51 confirmed Van Goghs and 34 Vermeers. Sargent is said to be the most prolific painter of the 19th century, with 800 portraits and 1,800 landscapes and figurative paintings.
Wow.
And the thing about him is, every one of them is good. You know, there's some painters you look at and you love one thing, and then the next thing you're not so sure. Everything he does is good. And this brings us full circle to our portraits. We are surrounded by traditional portraits created when traditional portraiture was still great. If you love portraiture, a Saturday night here is like a rock and roll fan attending Woodstock. Our early artists were masters in their own rights, and one of them, though not a member, was a peer of Sargent. Detroiter Gary Melchers trained in Paris at roughly the same time, and also gained entry into the annual salons at a young age. What's more, in 1889, Melcher and Sargent together became the first American painters to win the grand prize at the Paris Universal Exposition. The French painter Delacroix said, "A writer has to say almost everything to make himself understood. But in paintings, it's almost as if some mysterious bridge was set up between the spirit of the people in the picture and the beholder. Through the yellowing varnish and the years of grime, these faces of men long dead still speak to us. In them, we can imagine the bad jokes, the gentle ribbing, and the brilliant papers on eclectic subjects." I hope that what I've said tonight will provide you with another level of appreciation for these paintings, despite just a little something wrong with the mouth. Thank you.
That was fabulous.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Any questions?
Well, I guess, I don't know if this question or not, but I just gotta say, Maniscalco, Joe Maniscalco was our resident painter for years. And when it came time to paint my painting, I took it down in the basement with all the model railroad stuff. And the first thing he did is he looked around and said, pick one out, I'm not painting all this stuff.
Yeah.
If you look at the portrait over it's one engine that I picked up. The other thing that I think was so philosophical that he said is the hardest thing about painting a portrait is to decide when to stop painting.
I remember that from his funeral.
You've heard that too?
Yeah, his son said that, what he learned, Robert.
Yeah. His son is Bob, right?
Bob or Robert?
Yeah.
I know it was
Yeah,
Robert,
well,
yeah. Let me see.
But
It's very true.
he did some very famous painting. He did a painting of Gordie Howe and a lot of famous people.
One of the things I focused on people, mostly in this room, because I didn't want to get into any painter or subject that is still living to discuss any of that. And these are such great people.
The painting of Lothrop, the Melchers,
Yes.
I think a couple of us got hung up about that and started to try to, we don't know why we have that portrait, because we don't have any record that he was ever an officer of the club.
Lothrop?
I don't think he was president.
But wasn't it early tradition is some people would just donate their portraits to the club?
That easily
Don't
could be,
know.
yeah, that makes sense.
And then some presidents wouldn't have pictures either, so.
You might be, I don't know if you're all aware, Melcher's was just returned to its original owner 2 weeks ago
Ooh,
from the museum in Boston, the Boston Art Museum, where they had acquired it properly, but it had been stolen during World War II and has now been restored to the family that had been stolen from. Very interesting.
there's a wonderful Melchers at the Detroit Athletic Club.
Athletic club?
Mhm.
Yeah,
I've seen it at the DIE as the fencing.
no, as you go in the old front entrance, to your left, the room with all the newspapers and stuff, right at the end there, it's a soldier.
Have to make a special
Scottish.
visit. Yeah.
Yeah, Scottish, the
Yeah,
Scottish.
Yeah.
The same style as the Melcher we have. I mean, it's
Yeah.
recognizable when you see it.
Yeah.
The reason I mentioned Da Vinci, I just finished a book on Da Vinci. And they have discovered within the last 15 years through X-ray that what Da Vinci did on most of his portraiture was start with bones, add the muscles, and then cover it with the skin. He literally did that as a process into
That's
producing.
amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
John?
To speak to what Steve was saying is, yeah, it was religiously, it was a sin to dissect people in order to find out, and that's what one of the things Da Vinci did. So he was
Right.
sacrilege.
He committed sacrilege. He did.
Right, but he layered bone, the muscle, the skin.
Yep.
And that's why he did such a great job.
Did anyone happen to see the Nova this last Thursday? They had one on Da Vinci, and actually they stole some of my material, and I was afraid people were going to say I stole from that. But one of the things they did that was really interesting is they took the Mona Lisa and they digitally cleaned it. So taking off the discolorization and the darkening from the varnish is pretty straightforward, but they actually used analysis to figure out the different pigments, like copper and things like this, that went into that. And they analyzed how they would age over time, and they cleaned it so you could take a look at a fairly accurate depiction of how the Mona Lisa would have looked like when it was first printed. And Caroline was discussing tonight, it was like, why are these things so dark? And if you were to clean some of these, take the varnish and the grime off these things,
Cigar smoke.
yeah, imagine, they would come alive. I actually, again, I just ran out of time with things, but I digitally did that with one of the pictures. I just basically balanced it, lightened it, for the varnish. And it was amazing what a difference it would make, so.
The one that you showed, the woman who took that painting and was son to put the chain back.
Oh, yeah.
Now, she didn't actually screw it up like that, did she?
No, she did.
Yeah.
She was
I wish
just,
you'd showed what it really came out to be. It must have been.
It was.
That was it.
no, that was it.
That was it.
That was the result.
That was the result. What was it like before? It must have been
The
terrible.
picture I showed before was a picture, oh, well,
It had
what
spots
you
on it.
missed is there was a picture that showed where, so I showed like an original picture. When she started working on it, there were flakes of white in it where the paint had come off. It was a fresco, and it was in a damn church, and so it started to flake. And she thought she could just fill that in, but as she did, she realized that her patch didn't work too well, so she kind of spread out and took over the entire thing.
really? Yeah.
The irony of it is, though, this church was in terrible shape, but now it has become a tourist trap for people to go see Behold the Monkey.
I think it's worth noting that she was not a trained artist.
No, she wasn't, but that was her artwork
She was just
behind
a
her.
volunteer.
So, yeah, she was a volunteer, and she said it was okay with the priest.
Which is something for church people to keep in mind the next time somebody volunteers.
Yeah, you don't have to accept every volunteer.
Mark, just a comment, you know, I've been here for 24 years, I think now.
No, I don't think it was.
This has been an extraordinary presentation.
Yeah, really.
Absolutely worth it.
Mark, may I make known to our guests and to many of the prisons that may not know, is that we have now produced what I think are spectacular copies of all of our paintings. And if you,
Those are the ones that I was using.
which
yes.
is what you were using,
Yeah.
which to a certain extent, in some cases, I think have revealed things that we had not
Oh,
seen,
yeah.
because it seems to have taken some of the grime off. And-
Absolutely. you did
And
nice
I
job.
would say they're spectacular. And
Yeah.
I want to particularly thank Garrett for
Absolutely.
the effort, and
Very good.
and Carrie as well.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's a responsibility kind of now because we are the accidental curators of these pieces.
Which we are making efforts, just to let you know, the foundation is making efforts so that other people other than ourselves will have access to being able to see these things, which we think is very important.
Do we have a goal of eventually having all these pictures cleaned?
It depends on how much money y'all want to give.
I know a nice little old lady who will do it for cheap. Well, let's get some.
That was terrific.
One question though, before we go. Who knew of, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the name, but who knows Sargent? Or who knew of Sargent before
yeah.
this? Yeah, okay.
One of my favorite, actually.
So walk around with new eyes. after
Yes, absolutely.
I think
If you see me at your paper and I'm looking over to the side of something, it's because I
Bravo.
I think what he can do with satin, what he did with satin